Namaskar, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha. You're watching Perspective, the show where we discuss and analyze issues of current significance to India and to the world as well. Today, we're going to talk about the critical Iran nuclear talks that have resumed in Vienna after a 5-month hiatus. Representatives of Iran, China, France, Germany, Russia and the United Kingdom began the long-awaited talks in the Austrian capital on Monday, aiming to restore the 2015 accord, which limited Iran's nuclear activities in return for the lifting of sanctions. A possible return of the United States to the deal, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is also being discussed. Remember, back in 2018, the then American President Donald Trump had withdrawn unilaterally from the deal and also reimposed sanctions on Tehran. In response, Iran had stopped implementing parts of its commitments to the deal and also expanded its nuclear program significantly. Ahead of the talks now, Iran has demanded immediate lifting of all US sanctions as well as a guarantee that no future US president will unilaterally abandon the deal again. The United States, on its part, says it will take all steps necessary to come back into compliance, but at the same time also warns that the window of negotiations will not be open forever. The sense of urgency in bringing back the JCPOA has also been shown by other signatories after the first meeting on Monday. European Union official Enrique Mora, who is chairing the talks as well, expressed optimism. He was quoted as saying that Iran has agreed that the talks could resume largely where they had ended back in June, rather than with an entirely new agenda. With the new government elected in Iran in June, there had been fears that it would undo the progress made in the earlier rounds of talks held between April to June. However, the larger question is, will these critical talks meet the expectations on reviving the 2015 deal and also curtailing Iran's nuclear program? To discuss this and also some related aspects on the nuclear talks taking place in Vienna, I'm joined by an eminent panel of experts. So let me first introduce them to you. Joining me virtually are Professor Dinshaw J. Mistry, is a professor of international relations and Asian studies at the University of Cincinnati. Former Ambassador Mr. Jitendra Nath Mishra and Professor Swarn Singh, his chairperson, Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on the program today. Professor Mistry, allow me to begin the program first with you on the expectations from the talks taking place in Vienna, considering that the United States is not directly involved this time.
So the expectations are that they would basically outline a roadmap. That's the optimistic expectation as to where all sides want to go. The ideal point would, of course, be coming back to the original 2015 agreement, yes, where Iran scales down its nuclear activity to what it was under that agreement, and the US dials back sanctions so that really sanctions on Iran are lifted. If this set of talks at least gets a roadmap to how the sides could move towards that objective, that would be progress.
Absolutely. And the kind of challenges that this could face is something that I'll come back to and understand later on in the program. Professor Singh, you've been following and watching these talks for several years now. Do you expect any kind of tangible outcome this time around?
Effort is definitely being made, Tina, but I think the challenges are far more complex today than they were when they started negotiating last time in 2013. First of all, it is part of the larger effort of President Joe Biden to undo the damage that President Donald Trump's policies of confrontation had delivered, isolating United States almost. So it is not just re-engaging Iran, but through these negotiations also re-engaging other major stakeholders in the JCPOA, primarily in the United States' own friends and allies in Europe. But definitely, while the tone of Joe Biden administration is far more subtle, the policies have not changed at all. Joe Biden continues to carry on policies of President Trump in that sense, whereas you have seen that meanwhile, Iran has moved far ahead. There are news about enrichment having touched as much as 60%, and all you need is reach 90% to make your nuclear weapons. So Iran has moved away gradually. It has expanded the number of locations. Hundreds of advanced centrifuges have been added. The total material has increased. So the kind of going back to where the negotiations had achieved an enormous amount of success in 2015 is going to be enormously difficult for both sides. And you have to be careful now, because even during Joe Biden administration, what you heard the representative who attended the talks in Vienna is saying that, of course, we will try to seek compliance, but the window of negotiations is not open forever. Whereas people back home, other officials in the United States are even beginning to talk about quote unquote other options, which means either cyber attacks or military attacks on these facilities. And you have to hear the noise that is coming from Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Bennett. And he's clearly saying that Iran is only asking for favors and in return has nothing to offer. And he's called it a nuclear blackmail. So apparently all major parties that have stakes in how this JCPOA has to be revived are far more reticent in making any concessions as it appears now from negotiations. But only silver lining is that at least after 5 months, we had, as you mentioned, Tina, yourself, after coming of Ibrahim Raisi, there was doubts. He's a hardcore, staunch critique of West, and there was doubts about whether he will going to restart where negotiations had gone up to May this year. And in June, he had promised that we will start from where we had stopped last time. So in that sense, I think it's a little silver lining on negotiations beginning, but it's going to be a long haul with a lot of challenges. And I think all parties are far more reticent in making concessions today than they were when the last time negotiations began, as I just mentioned. So it's part of, I think in that sense, orchestrating face-saving activities that Joe Biden administration has been doing with one after another. Examples of meeting with Xi Jinping could be another example. So it's damage limitation exercise. His domestic ratings are going down in that sense because of various issues of pandemic, employment, and economy not picking up faster. So it's a part of that larger exercise of face saving largely, but I don't think it's going to reach any quick solutions. And revival of JCPOA may be a long haul for all parties.
Ambassador, what do you think? What is the kind of progress that we are going to see in the talks that are underway? So Professor certainly doesn't see that kind of optimism, which was earlier yesterday showcased by the chair of these talks, the European Union representative. The silver lining has been that the Iranian negotiating team has agreed to build the talks on the progress that have been made in the previous rounds. But the insistence that is coming on from Iran's side to not just completely lift the US sanctions, but a sort of guarantee that in the future as well, no US president is going to revoke or withdraw from this deal. How feasible do those demands look?
Well, as a practitioner, a former practitioner, I will not talk about silver linings. I will talk about realism. And these talks are really about talks. They are not about solutions. This is the beginning of a process and not the beginning of a solution. Why? Professor Singh said two very important points, which I was going to mention, but thank you very much. 60% enrichment has been accomplished of uranium. 90% is weapon grade. So that's a very dangerous signal coming from Iran. Now, you can ask the question, was it right of President Trump to impose those sanctions? Because after those sanctions imposed in 2018, the effect of those sanctions were completely opposite of what was intended. It has given Iran the opportunity to ramp up its weapon-grade plutonium reprocessing to 60%, not yet weapon-grade. Mm-hmm. And Iran is, in a way, dangling this, making it very public. And Iranians are great negotiators. They are among the best negotiators in the world. And therefore, I will not put it past them to do this kind of diplomatic brinkmanship repeatedly, as they are obviously doing. Now, the US has said the opportunity is now going to get closed. There is a limited opportunity in terms of time. Well, what does it mean? It means that the US is more anxious to get this done than Iran, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And Iran will buy as much of time as possible to ramp up making the plutonium more and more pure, not weapon grade perhaps, and then they will extract as much as they can. Now, there seems to be two concessions from both sides. I just heard that Iran has agreed to start the negotiations from where they were 6 months ago. Now, if that is the case, then that's a concession from Iran, because Iran is taking such a maximalist position at this time that seemed very unlikely. Now, it's a question of classic diplomacy: sanctions, nuclear, sequencing. What do we mean by sequencing? In any diplomatic negotiation, in a classical negotiation, where the idea is to get the maximum benefit, each side ramps up its demands to the maximum extent possible to rattle and to unbalance the other side.
Okay.
Well, the US is saying that. Professor Singh mentioned the other point I was going to mention: other options. The US official dealing with this just said it yesterday, it was reported, other options. And it has been interpreted to mean options by Israel cyber and taking out Israeli scientists, Iranian scientists and Iranian facilities. Well, we don't know. So that's a kind of brinkmanship coming from the US also. But to me, it seems that Iranians are masters of negotiation, and they are playing the game pretty well. As far as sanctions and oil are concerned, well, Iran has been selling a lot of oil to China, and everybody knows about it. It's all over the media. And how is it that the US is not enforcing sanctions as rigidly as they should have done if these sanctions are in place? They're, in a way, winking. And as Professor Singh said, it's about trying to improve relations with China also, and also your European partners and allies, because President Trump's sanctions lost a lot of credibility and goodwill among allies for the US and friends, partners, okay, important partners like India.
Okay.
So therefore, I will say that this is a step forward, but this is more talks about talks.
Professor Mistry, coming back to you, because Ambassador mentioned that Iran has adopted this maximalist position. The insistence this time has been, in fact, what explains the toughened stance of Iran? Is it because it believes that its geopolitical position has now strengthened because of the progress, nuclear progress that it has made over the years?
I would say that the nuclear posturing on Iran's part is exactly what our other panelists said. It is a bargaining, giving, all sides are exercising certain options to strengthen their hands in negotiations. At the same time, Iran, being a master negotiator, is going to be careful to calibrate that it doesn't ramp up its nuclear activity to a certain red line where that is a deal breaker. So definitely enriching up to 60%. Yes, it gives some technical option, but it's also a negotiating position. Expanding the stock of enriched uranium. Now they have about 2 tons. The agreement had only 300 kilogram limit, and before the agreement they had about 6 to 7 tons. So, they could ramp up that 2 tons to 2.5, 3 tons. And on the other hand, freeze it if negotiations make progress. So all these are, in fact, negotiating tactics.
Okay, Professor, another question that comes to mind, looking at the situation, because the expectations aren't quite high on the talks that are taking place in Vienna, and the United States itself claiming that the window of opportunity will not be open forever. What does it indicate? Does the United States of America have a plan B just in case the deal doesn't work through, it is not revived? And what, according to you, can that plan B be? Will it go the Israel way?
So there is, in fact, plan B and plan C and plan D. Plan A, as I said, is to try negotiations to come as close to the original JCPOA as possible. Plan B is a freeze for freeze, which was the 2013 agreement before the JCPOA, where everybody just freezes at the level they are. Sanctions freeze at the level, including China's violation of sanctions, which would be acceptable, and Iran freezes at its level. That is an acceptable status quo. plan C is that none of this works. Sanctions ramp up to 100%, and Iran increases its enrichment to 100, higher levels. And we really see plan C leading to the crisis of the early 2010s, where again the pressure from Israel for military action ramps up. So, there are multiple plan A, B, and C out there.
Okay. Professor Singh, so since we're talking about alternative plans that America and the other powers could have in stopping, preventing the enhancement of nuclear capabilities of Iran, but just in case that doesn't happen through, and the claims that Iran is actually dragging its feet on the nuclear talks table, and at the same time it is in fact working to further build up on its nuclear capabilities, how concerning is it for the region? A nuclear-capable Iran, what does it mean for the regional geopolitics and strategically as well?
I think you have hit upon a very important question here, because the regional balance so far had only Israel, which was known to have nuclear weapons, which it will never confirm or deny. Now, if you have another major power, in fact, Iran is the only country in the region which is not friendly or allied to the United States. And Iran is increasingly seen as villain of peace in the entire West Asian region. And Iran obtaining nuclear weapons could throw up enormous challenge for the entire region in that sense. Will then Israel also openly declare itself as a nuclear weapon state? And what that means for the entire region could have a very, very deep and difficult implications. But what is interesting here to see now is that after the boomeranging of Taliban coming to power in Afghanistan, we have seen increasing bifurcation of global major powers, where you have countries like China, Russia, Pakistan, Turkey, Malaysia, Iran going on one side, and US and friends and allies on the other. You notice that these leaders of Russia and China did not attend G20 in Rome or Glasgow meeting. And in that sense, there is an increasing bifurcation, which again makes these negotiations in Vienna very interesting, because you notice the language being used by Chinese and Russian representatives there. They think it's a positive beginning. And of course, to some extent, EU chair also says positive and urgency is being realized, but there's no timeline immediately. What will follow from here? Where do we go from here? So in that sense, I think increasingly it's going to be far more difficult for United States, despite having plan A, B, C, and D, to actually achieve something where you can bring back Iran to what it had already accepted in JCPOA of 2015. Where you remember that the enrichment was pegged to 3.67%, which is so low. It was supposed to sell out its enriched uranium stockpiles, and other countries were supposed to buy it to ensure it has only low enriched uranium for power generation. But now, since then, because of increasingly, I think, confrontationist policies of President Trump, which were, withdrawing from JCPOA, increasing sanctions, despite IAEA repeatedly saying Iran was in compliance with JCPOA. And then, of course, ultimately, when you saw General Qasem was killed in airstrike in Iraqi airport, that was the red line that Iran said, we are no longer now interested in continuously following the JCPOA. And they started increasing both locations, equipment, centrifuges, materials, enrichment of uranium, everything. So Iran has really on the ground moved much far away now to ask it to go all the way back. So it's not going to be easy to put the genie back into the bottle in that sense. So all we are seeing here is fundamentally a damage limitation focus, where they, as Ambassador just mentioned, it's a talk for talks in that sense, to just showcase in that sense that something is being engaged. But I don't think that Iran could now go back to where it had agreed to enrich only 3.67% of uranium, because it has gone really far beyond that. And now Iran feels emboldened because there are other countries. In fact, go back to 1980s, 1987 onwards, when Pakistan used to declare to the world, we are only a screwdriver away. That is when Pakistan had helped Iran. Later, Chinese helped Iran. So these are countries that had originally been behind Iranian nuclear program, and today they have kind of ganged together along with Russia, Turkey, Malaysia, and others. They would stand by Iran even if they openly continuously engage in negotiations for bringing back Iran to the JCPOA. But an underlining factor is that they are all ensuring that Iran continues to be a troublemaker for United States. And that makes a challenge for United States much more complex.
Absolutely. So very, very complex challenges and expectations, very grim. Ambassador, India is obviously not part of the JCPOA, and there's not something much larger at stake. But given the situations, if we talk about the geopolitics in the region and the complex challenges for the entire world, that the repercussions of an emboldened nuclear Iran, if maybe in the coming years, what would be in the best interest of India?
Well, India's position is very clearly, number one, that it supports JCPOA. And number two, India is not at all in favor of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. It's been made very clear. Just a few months ago, India called upon Iran to allow the IAEA process to continue. And Iran has actually closed all the taps. No inspections are going on. And this is part of the saber rattling. Now, better diplomatic relations, it stands to reason, and it's quite self-evident that better diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran are in India's interest, very much so. And we have seen that with regard to the sanctions. And we can deal more smoothly with both the parties when their own relations are better, as we saw after the sanctions that were reimposed by President Trump, beg your pardon, in 2018. Now, India welcomed the November 2015 conclusion of the JCPOA, obviously, and therefore, with regard to oil, now India has certain benefits from Iran also in terms of rupee payments and other things. But of course, India had to curb oil imports and bring it down to zero in 2019. But India also found other partners and choices, shale from the US, for example, and Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and other suppliers. They came into the picture at the cost of Iran. Now, as regards the security of Indians, well, if push comes to shove, we have 8 to 9 million Indians in the Gulf, and their security will be of great importance, a primary concern to us. Then Chabahar, it's very important for India for two reasons. One is connectivity to Central Asia, and of course, oil and gas is the other issue on which Iran is very important for India. Now, the connectivity to Central Asia, it has been sputtering on the Chabahar project. It has not really taken off in the way we would have liked. There are many reasons. I won't go into that. The sanctions being one of them, and lack of speed on our part being another. But in June 2021, the first container shipment from Finland arrived in Chabahar, and we've sent wheat supplies to Afghanistan 3 or 4 times already, and Iranian cargo has also gone through Chabahar to other countries. So it's not as if it has.
Okay, we seem to be facing some technical issue in connectivity with the former ambassador. Professor Mistry, a quick concluding remark from you on the way ahead.
The way ahead is step by step. I would agree that these are talks about talks. If the next step can be getting a roadmap to either plan A or B, and if parties are in agreement of what the plan A or B is, that would be progress. These talks won't end quickly, so we need to expect 6 months, a year. It's not going to be a quick talk, but as long as there's progress, that would be positive.
Absolutely. So no tangible outcome expected of this round of talks. But as our panelists have suggested, even though the expectations are grim and the challenges are very, very complex this time around, because Iran is much more emboldened in terms of its position in the region, and the United States of America is still working on different kinds of plans to stop this expansion of nuclear activity in Iran, but it remains to be seen what lies ahead in the coming months. So with that, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of the program. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on the program today and sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. So that's it from us on this edition of Perspective. Thank you very much to all our viewers for their time.